Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. Down the years you may have seen me on the telly or heard me on the wireless, but this is different. This is the Brian Taylor podcast, brought to you by The Herald. Coming up.
Personally, I think the lobbying register is a band-aid solution. I don't think it's anywhere near transparent enough. I don't think it can be fixed either.
You don't need to be rich or powerful or a massive corporation to get time with the minister.
When you compare even the situation here just now, even with Westminster, where you've got, a very only registered lobbyists have to be on the register of lobbyists. It's not even loopholes there. It's just absolute, sort of falling straight down into a pit.
Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. Very warm welcome to the latest episode of my Herald podcast. Now, we've got a special edition this week, building on the quite remarkable series in the Herald all week on Who Runs Scotland. For the series, data was gathered by the Ferret, an investigative news cooperative of renown. Now, it covers everything. The series covers everything from lobbying to quangos, from whiskey to wind farms. And to discuss all of that, I'm just joined by two journalists and by two lobbyists given prominent billing in the report. From the Herald, delighted to welcome Alistair Grant. From the Ferret, Karin Goodwin, co-editor. And then the lobbyists, Andy Maciver of Message Matters and James Mackenzie, who specialises in environmental issues. A very warm welcome to you all. Alistair, let's go. We're going to try and discuss a load of things that were raised in the series, but given the guests and given the tenor, let's go with lobbying first. Bring us up to speed on what was said in the series.
Yeah, so as you say, it was an investigation by the Ferret, published in the Herald, that essentially found in relation to lobbying that hundreds of meetings between Scottish ministers and kind of multinationals, wealthy individuals, other outside interests, were left off the lobbying register last year due to essentially kind of loopholes in the legislation. So the issue is that under the Lobbying Scotland Act 2016, which came into force in 2018, all face-to-face lobbying is regulated. So details must be given about the subject of the discussion, the purpose, what was said, the people involved. However, lobbying by phone calls or emails, other communications such as WhatsApps, are not included. And ministers also don't need to enter things, or meetings, don't need to be entered in the register if they were instigated by a minister. So the existence of these meetings was revealed by the Ferret in the diaries of ministers, ministerial engagements, which is published monthly. However, these often only contain really a couple of words to describe what was discussed, and might not even have all the relevant names. So it's very much an issue of transparency and how power operates in Scotland.
Okay, Alistair, thanks for that. So we've got the issue of the unregistered. We've got the issue generally of the extent of lobbying of the Scottish Government, and also, I should stress, of the UK Government, including the Scotland office. We'll come to that later. But Karin from the Ferret has got the source. Karin, is there something wrong going on? Is it not reasonable for organisations to get their points of view across to government?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, from the offset, we were very clear that there's nothing wrong with lobbying in itself. And in fact, lobbying is a really essential part of the democratic process. But what we were interested in was issues around transparency. And that's something that a lot of the campaigners have been raising with us. Issues around transparency and clarity, and also concerns about a couple of things. Concerns about the way that lobbying tilts in favour of those that can afford it, and also just kind of closeness to power, I suppose, and some of those revolving doors that come around, and what that might mean for, again, transparency issues.
What's your take? Is it sinister? Is it straightforward? What's your take on that sort of spectrum?
I think the thing about kind of power and influence is it can be quite nebulous, right? Yeah. And so I think that it is reasonable that when you go into a meeting, even for some other purpose, you might find yourself in a position that would, in other circumstances, if it did need to be kind of registered as registered lobbying, might constitute that. And therefore, if we had minutes and better, sort of a wider range of things that were put onto the lobbying register, then we would have more scrutiny over that. Another thing that's come up is that the timing of that, and just how quickly those ministerial engagements, for example, as scant as they are published, and there's often a 6-month delay. By that point, even looking at them retrospectively, there's maybe the opportunity for raising questions has passed. So there's a couple of different things that are going on there that maybe undermine some of our real kind of ambitions for a very open, transparent democracy.
And Karin, just before I bring in our other guest, Karin, a number of organisations, perhaps on the environmental front, perhaps on the citizens' side, just arguing that business has too much access to the government generally by comparison with other sectors of society and the economy.
And we did, we looked through every meeting that the ministers had in 2020, and we didn't manage to analyse completely how many were, the percentages of, but it was very clear, particularly from certain ministers' diaries, that industry was dominating.
Couldn't that be because they're dealing with the economy and they're trying to help Scotland grow?
Absolutely, but when you look at if you're dealing with energy and you want to look at whether hydrogen is a good investment, you also want to hear the other side of that. You also want to hear about carbon capture. And there were very, the Scottish Government said that those were happening in environmental briefs. They have also introduced a more sort of cross-departmental way of working in this new term. So I think even themselves, they recognise the need to hear those range of voices at such a crucial point as we go up to the COP26, for example.
Okay, thanks for that. Hold those thoughts for a minute. Lots to talk about there. Let's bring in Andy Maciver. Andy, you were top of the pops. You were number one among the lobbyists. Congratulations on that. Much more seriously, what about the argument there that you're a filter, you're a channel, you're a conduit for business to pour their ideas into the ears of ministers where others perhaps don't have that access?
Look, it's not really about access, to be honest. It's not difficult in Scotland. Scotland's a very open system. It's a very open government. It's a very open parliament. It's not difficult to meet MSPs. It's not difficult to meet ministers. It's really more about expertise than anything else. I think there's a few. Lobbying has been subject to a number of investigations of this sort over the last couple of years, and I actually think that it's generally been a good thing. I'm supportive of the lobbying register because what it does is it shows that what people thought was there is not really there. It was a problem which a lot of people thought existed, but actually generally doesn't, because as lobbyists always knew, the vast majority of what we do, well, for a start, is for charities. You can see from the official figures, far from it being a big business-led occupation. Obviously, the off-register stuff, I don't have numbers for, I can't answer to, but there are official numbers published by the registrar. And charities account for more than double the returns of any other sector. So this is largely, and the vast majority of my clients, I publish all my clients over the last 10 years on the website. Every single client I've ever worked for is on our website. We do that proactively. And if you look on the website, you'll see the vast majority of them are charities. And they're charities you can't afford to hire a comms professional full time, so they hire the time and the expertise of people like us to go in and be a middleman.
I'll bring in James in a second, but Karin, you're looking very sceptical at that.
Well, I actually did this kind of analysis looking specifically at ministers and special advisors, and actually we found two things. Charities did come out slightly higher on the register when you look at just ministers and charities, but only slightly, certainly not double, nothing like that. And actually in the last year, charities have really fallen away, and it's industry and business that dominate in 2020 on the lobbying register for regulated lobbying. So that's not actually accurate when you look at ministers and special advisors.
Andy, what about that?
Yeah, okay. I didn't say it was ministers and special advisors. I said it was the official numbers from the registrar. So it's a complaint with the registrar rather than with me. But I think that there are issues. There's no question about the fact that there are quite a number of issues, and I think that it is worth exploring what they are. For example, the exemptions are definitely worth exploring. For instance, you see on the registered returns, there are very few returns from trade unionists. Now, according to the law, trade unions are lobbyists. That's what the law says. So they are lobbyists. Very few returns. And the reason for that, of course, is that if a trade union is talking to an MSP or minister or special advisor about pay and conditions, it's exempt. It's not registrable. So there are lots of things, I think, to look into in this. I think the exemptions need to be significantly slimmed down, because in my view, this is a good thing. I think we should see exactly what's going on, because when you do see what's going on, you begin to understand what lobbying actually is. It's not a dark art. It's basically about spreadsheets, and it's not actually, it's far from...
What do you mean by that? I don't understand that.
Well, the vast majority of what we do is actually quite administrative work. It is creating strategies and creating plans to make sure that our clients can get their message across to MSPs and ministers and government, so that they can, hopefully exert change and influence there, which will help them go about whatever business they want to go about. And, as I say, the vast majority of my clients are charities, many businesses as well. But, you tend not to, in these reports, you tend to hear about, the big businesses that get worked for. You don't tend to hear about the small charities that a lot of lobbyists do a lot of work for, which is much more common.
Let's bring in James Mackenzie. James, you came a little further down the list than Andy, but you managed to cope with that disappointment by putting out a tweet saying that if folk can't afford Andy, they can always come to you if they want to do good. You see yourself as doing good, do you? I mean, that wicked attempt to undercut your rival was one thing, but you see yourself as doing good. Some might be a bit sceptical about that.
Yeah, I mean, for an industry, if you want to call it an industry that specialises in crafting public opinion, shaping ministers' views about them, got terrible comms. People think lobbying is bribes and all the tobacco industry and the arms industry and all that kind of thing. And as far as I know, there are no bribes in Scotland. The industries that I don't approve of definitely do lobbying. But I personally work for entirely either environmental NGOs or the renewable sector or other charities. And actually, I do see the real imbalance that you're talking about. I'll give you one practical example.
I mean, even sticking to the renewable sector, even the renewable sector, that is in itself contentious. It's, wind farms are themselves contentious. Offshore wave and wind and tidal is contentious, and it might be cutting out somebody that's from a different point of view. Are you not? You say you're trying to persuade, but could it not be argued you're persuading against another point of view that maybe isn't getting a hearing?
Oh, I certainly think that I would love both sides of every issue to get an equal hearing. Yeah. But that's a question of who you elect and who they want to listen to. I'm thinking of particular ministers, including perhaps some recently departed, who were absolutely on one side of every issue, and the environmental NGOs never got heard. So, I personally
can't imagine who you have in mind there. Can't imagine who that is.
I'm sure the listeners will be able to figure it out.
But I'm certainly not going to name the individual. I'll leave it to you.
No, I'm not going to either. Personally, I think lobbying register is a band-aid solution. I don't think it's anywhere near transparent enough. I don't think it can be fixed either. One of the things that it includes, which is questionable, so some of my entries that Karin talked about, I'm meeting opposition MSPs to brief them on where government is supporting or licensing environmental damage, and then I have to register that and the topic of it needs to go on the register. So actually, if that publishes very quickly and it's a bit of a lag with it, you could end up tipping off government on how to avoid PR disasters or avoid being held accountable. I think that's not people think of as lobbying. But personally, what I think would be more suitable would be all government ministers must minute all meetings, and they must all be published within a week or 10 days. With
even casual chats in the Holyrood Chamber or at a social event that's designed for something else entirely.
Only where somebody's trying to influence policy. I mean, I think if you meet them at the 19th hole and you're like, I could use a tax break for my oil business, then you should register that. Absolutely, you should register that. Yeah. In the same way, I was quite happy to register a meeting with an MSP in the vegetable aisle, as I talked about before, where I actually wanted him for a photo op. But there are exemptions that you should apply. I mean, some stuff is commercially confidential, and that's covered by the terms of freedom of information. So I think I would just make them all public.
Yeah. Alistair, there's a lot of skepticism about lobbying, to say the least. There's a lot of skepticism, isn't there? I mean, what's been the response to? We'll come to the other elements of the series, remarkable series, I say. What's been the response generally on the question of lobbying?
Well, I think the points made are quite right, that people have this view of the lobbying industry as kind of shadowy and necessarily a bad thing, and it's a huge and kind of varied industry. I mean, all lobbying really is trying to put forward your interests, whatever they are, to the Scottish Government, to ministers, to people who can enact change, and to MSPs as well. So there's a huge kind of range in lobbying. And for charities,
doesn't lobbying, funded lobbying, fee-paid lobbying, give privileged access to one sector that perhaps others can't afford, Alistair?
Well, I think,
that's the accusation, isn't it?
You choose a cliche, I suppose money is power to a degree, and wealthy individuals will always have access to government in a way that other people might not. I think you can see that from the kinds of people who secure meetings with government ministers sometimes.
Yeah, okay. Just on that very, hold that thought on that very thing. Question name is Sarah Collins, put in a question. Charities lobbying, I'm reading it out now, charities lobbying government doesn't mean governments listen. This isn't just about access, but about whose influence is most powerful. And she says, business and corporate lobbyists don't just have more access, they have more power as they are listened to. Just the point you were making there, Alistair. She asks why. Why do you think that's an accurate description, first of all, Karin?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. And, you know, as Alistair said, their money does talk. And when people have got more to lose, then, you know, they really do need to listen closely, and they need to think about the ramifications of not giving an organisation, a business, what it is that they are there for, and to come up with ways of negotiating so that that they are not stymied in some way from something else that they want to do. So I think that, you know, that is not always the case with charities. Now, charities also do provide a range of services, but they are very often on the back foot here in the power dynamic. So yes, access is one thing.
Yeah. Finish, Karin, and I'll bring in Andy right away.
Yeah, sure. But access is one thing, and access is not equal, I would say, firstly. And then secondly, yeah, who gets a better hearing is a definite issue.
Andy Maciver.
Look, it would be lovely if this was all correct. And it would be lovely if all lobbying was done by big tobacco and big oil, and there were, you know, brown envelopes and all that sort of stuff. That would be great because it would make a good story. But it's not real, right? I mean, the reality is that this government and the ministers under this government are amongst the most egalitarian ministers I've ever come across. You don't need to be rich or powerful or a massive corporation to get time with the minister. I have had, for some of my pro bono clients who are pro bono because they can't afford to pay me anything at all because they're such small charities, I've had them in front of ministers and cabinet secretaries.
And why did they come to you? Why did they come to you? Why did they come to you?
Because I'm
exactly because you can get them the time with ministers that they can't get otherwise.
Well, actually, no, but you see, it's more about expertise than anything else. It's not about money. They don't.
No, it's about connections.
A lot of small charities
don't have.
But they're not paying me anything. My pro bono clients are paying me anything. So anybody, any pro bono client could approach me and ask me to do a bit of work pro bono for them. This is not the closed shop that people want it to be. It's just not. I know people want it to be like that, but it isn't like that. James
Mackenzie.
I mean, I love Andy very much, but I'm going to disagree with him on the extent to which business shapes policy, in line with the question that we were just asked. Overwhelmingly, on issue that I work on, for the marine environment, rewilding, you name it, decisions are made that suit existing vested interests, whether it's the grouse shooters, whether it's the dredgers and trawlers, whoever it is. And the reason for that is not particularly about lobbying. That's about the politics of people who we put into government. And I'm afraid part of the consensus between Conservative, SNP, Liberal and Labour is we've got to put business interests first. We've got to do what we're told. We don't want to get a shoeing from the business pages. So some of this is...
Andy, you were formerly director of communications for the Greens. I understand where you're coming from, and that's reasonable to make that point. But I mean, could it not just be that they have the case that the ministers think is valid, and that ultimately they believe that is the way to advantage Scotland rather than necessarily advantaging one sector of the economy?
Yeah, I mean...
well, you see, that's when you're talking here... You've got to make a distinction here between money and size or influence. It's not about business. We always want to draw this back to the private sector, right? This is what we want to do. We want to draw it back to capitalism in the private sector. But we're not talking here, for instance, about the influence of a massive trade union or a massive multinational environmental charity. They are clearly, if you pick, I'm not going to name any organisations in this podcast. I think it's the wrong thing to do. But look, pick a massive environmental charity and pick a tiny children's charity. Okay, clearly, the massive environmental charity has got more influence than the children's charity. But that's not because of money. That's because of size, influence, what they can do in terms of carrying a message forward. So and businesses can do that too, of course. But like a huge multinational corporation will have more influence than an SME with 5 staff. But that's not about business versus public. It's not private versus public. It's about size, and that's different than money. It's not the same thing.
Karin, not for the first time, you're looking sceptical, Karin.
Sorry. Well, it is also about the expenditure power of that organisation, right? So it does actually boil down to money ultimately, I think. I think.
So why not look at trade unions or other
we
big
did look at trade unions,
then?
and I think you'll notice that Dave Moxham was also pulled out and quoted in my piece, because trade unions were someone that I was that were at the table often. And what he was saying was, we're in the room representing 500,000 members. We shout about what we do. We're very open about it. And, you might say that's the same with you in terms of putting things on the regulated lobby register, but not all consultancies, as you know, are open, and they certainly don't all give their client lists, and they don't say what they were there to do. So that's a very different situation.
Karin, let me put another point to you, a challenging point to you. I mean, some of the examples you raise in very detailed and thorough work, you talk about ministers contacting interested parties with regard to the BIFAB fabrication yards in Methil and Lewis. You talk about attempts to rescue the steel industry in Scotland. You talk about attempts to contact the energy companies regarding the just transition, etc., etc. But shouldn't ministers be trying to sort out BIFAB, sort out steel, and sort out the just transition in the North Sea? Isn't that the job that they have? And to do that, they would have to contact business.
Yeah. Absolutely. But why not contact a range of people? Business are not the only experts on these things. And I think the point is that there are workers, there are communities who also have something to say about this. And if these meetings are just about really saving industry and saving workers' jobs and really working for the people in the communities, then let's, as James said, be completely open, transparent, publish the meeting minutes. Fiona Hislop did a lot of talking around that, but she didn't talk about that.
Alistair, ministers would presumably say they are talking to the communities, but if they're going to get some transformation, they also have to talk to those who are, frankly, bringing investment to the table as well.
Yeah, I mean, you want to then to talk to as many people as possible, and all the people who are involved in decisions who could be involved. I think one of the issues here is that it's maybe not so much that shady things are necessarily going on, but it's the perception that there's a lack of transparency. It's just as bad. Well, not just as bad, but it's a problem in and of itself, so that just that the lobbying register has these loopholes and that perception can exist is not conducive to, a healthy situation. So I think that.
Andy, what about that? What about those loopholes and the gaps?
I want to close all. I just think there's too many. There's 13 exemptions in the lobbying register. Too many. I mean, I just don't see why you need to do that. I mean, certainly from my point of view, I think it's unhelpful. I actually over-register. I've had stuff come back to me from the registrar saying you can't register this, it's not registrable. Whereas I want to register it because I think it's a good thing that people know who's seeing who and about what. But you see, I think this is where I actually don't think James and Karin and I are that. I know that we kind of want, the story demands somebody like me to be on the wrong side of it. But I actually don't think that we're all that far apart on it. I mean, 90%, at least 90%, I don't know, of my client base is SMEs or charities. And I want lots more of that going on the lobbying register, far more of that, because I think that's right. I think that you can't just listen to the biggest, but whether it's a trade union or a big corporation or whoever it is, you can't only listen to the biggest voice. You have to listen to the other voices as well.
When you're trying to, set up a meeting or trying to push a case, just maybe James as well in a moment. But how do you do it? How do you go about it? What do you write to the department? Do you contact private office? Do you contact backbenchers? What do you do when you're trying to get access for a case? Andy, please, yeah.
It's quite variable depending on who the client is, what the topic is, and whether it's a minister or a special advisor or an MSP. But in general terms, I try to use off-register contact as a last resort. So I try to avoid phone calls if I possibly can. It's a bit more difficult during COVID, obviously, as you'll understand. But I try to do in-person meetings. During COVID, I've tried to do video meetings because video like this sort of thing is registrable.
Zoom or StreamYard or one of the other, you have to register,
because it's face-to-face, it's registrable, whereas a phone call's not. So I try to avoid.
That does seem ridiculous, doesn't it? It just seems simply ludicrous.
I know. Well, I know that's rules, isn't it?
Them's the rules. James, please.
Oh yeah, I mean, in order to get a meeting, I mean, one thing Andy said earlier on, which is definitely true, is you just go in the front door. As in, if I want a meeting with an MSP, then I'll just email their MSP email address, and their staffer will say yay or nay, and do you want to have a meeting?
They'll either take it or they won't. Yeah, and they'll take it presumably if they feel there's something interesting to hear. Yeah.
Yeah, so they might have a particular interest in the issues. They might, if they're interested in litter, then they might want to meet and talk about deposit return or something else that I work on. And it does, Karin said it's about connections as well, and that does really matter because, and it sort of it should, and it sounds a terrible thing. I'm going to be the new Andy on this bit, which is if you've got a long-standing relationship with an MSP, and they have seen that the stuff that you've brought to them is truthful and accurate and a fair representation, and you've not hidden anything from them, then the next time you go to them, you're going to find it easier to get a meeting than if you're cold calling them and you've never met them before. And that is legitimate. I particularly with the environment committees last year, I built up a relationship with members on the two relevant committees. And then if I want to have another meeting about something which I haven't spoken about before, it is easier to get, it's just, they know they're not getting sold some kind of duff line. They know they'll get something which is accurate.
Let's bring in Alistair, just a quick line on the back of that. I think it's important to emphasise is that MSPs and ministers and special advisors, so they're the three categories that you need to register. MSPs, ministers, and special advisors, not only do they like lobbying, they need lobbying. And that's not just lobbying from third-party companies like my company, that's lobbying from in-house heads of communications at organisation X. If it wasn't for lobbying, they would have very, very little to talk about when they go about their business.
Surely a private office. And,
I mean, if you look at the average speech in Holyrood, and you dissect that speech, a huge amount of any speech in Holyrood will be information which has been given to them by a third part, by a lobbyist.
So Andy, when you hear a speech, you say, "That's my bit. I wrote that. That's my bit."
Well, not enough, obviously. BT,
not often enough. You're not paid enough. Alistair, Karin, what do you make of what you've heard so far? Particularly that point about the need to eliminate those loopholes. Alistair, then Karin.
Probably just repeat what I said before. That I think there is a need to eliminate the loopholes, or at least look at this issue again. I think the perception, just allowing that perception to exist is a problem in and of itself. And so, I mean, just to use an example that I know people use quite a lot when it comes to these loopholes, if you were in a video meeting with someone, with a minister, for example, and you were on Zoom, you would in theory have to register this on the register. But if you just shut off the video in Zoom and just use audio only, looking at these rules, that would then not have to go in the lobbying register, which just seems completely ludicrous from an outside point of view, whatever the reasoning for it was.
Is that because what the legislation is behind the development and communications?
I'm not sure the reason was for it, but that is my reason.
Because we've got such persuasive faces, Brian. I mean, just look at us.
That's what it is. One look at that beard and those specs and you sign up immediately. Karin, on what you've heard so far.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that Scotland could do this really well, right? We've got an opportunity at the moment to close these loopholes, to really kind of achieve our ambitions to be properly transparent. And I know we're going to come on and talk about this later on, but when you compare even the situation here just now, even with Westminster, where you've got, a very only registered lobbyists have to be on the register of lobbyists. It's not even loopholes there. It's just absolute, sort of falling straight down into a pit. So, we could do this differently here, and there's very clear things we could do to make that, to change that. And I think that what a lobbying register does is, it can help you to look in the mirror. Now, there's another thing about that, which is that you have to make that accessible to the public, because it's all very well saying, oh, it's all there. But if people can't just easily access that information, then, that's a bit disingenuous.
In my experience as well, Karin, I mean, I hear Andy and James saying that you can just email an MSP or contact a committee clerk. You can, I know that for certain, and I've advised people regularly to do that. But folk are scared. Folk are scared to do that. They think there's this network of cleverness or this network of access, this network of influence, and they think they have to, they have to have all these skills and these techniques and these systems, and they don't, do they? Karin first, then Andy. I see try to come in. Karin first.
When the Scottish Government, they did do some open government things that were really interesting, going to different places, going to schools, going to islands, making themselves more accessible and out of the building. Now, I totally understand, we've had COVID. It's been an incredibly difficult year for everyone, politicians, no less. But, let's try and make government more accessible in lots of different ways. Let's try and look at the systems. Let's try and look at what we're trying to achieve here. The SNP say they're trying to achieve an increase, a decrease in inequalities. That's a really key thing. We're not doing that. So how can we make democracy more equitable for people?
Let's bring in Andy Maciver, and then I'm going to move on to some other topics.
Yeah, I think I don't want to downplay James and I, because people like James and I have some skills. And, one of those is actually being able to, as we would call it, package up something that one of our clients does and make it interesting. So, I'll have a client come to me, and a charity sale come to me and say, this is what we do. And I'll say, oh, right, I see that thing there that you do. That's actually quite interesting. I think MSPs might be interested in that. And because they're not experienced in the political system or the media or anything else, they won't necessarily know that what they're doing is of interest. And our job is to say, actually, that looks really good. Let's build something around that and tell the story to politicians. And that is where the foot in the door is not difficult, as we've talked about. You send an email, right? It's not hard. The hard bit is to actually create something that means something and that gets you the meeting.
Thanks, Andy. Alistair, we're going to move on to some of the other issues. Vast range of issues, as I said, raised in the series. Just bring us up to speed on some of the others, the other topics that will be raised this week.
Yeah, as you say, vast range of issues. I would encourage people to go and read the kind of days and days investigations by the Ferret. But just to go into some of them, a lot of it's to do with ownerships. We've got kind of the ownership patterns of wind farms, for example. I think the finding was that nearly a third of Scotland's biggest wind farms have owners linked to offshore tax havens. We've got looking at the whisky industry as well, where nearly 70% of malt whisky distilleries are ultimately owned by companies out with Scotland. And I think today as well, quite an interesting kind of focus on quangos, which basically found chief executives of quangos appointed by the Scottish Government were paid more than £10 million last year. And I think maybe people won't be surprised that some of these people earn quite a lot of money considering the size of these organisations. But I think just use one particular example, I think it is quite eye-watering to see the amount of money that's paid to Tim Hare, who is the turnaround director of Ferguson Marine, who is paid £790,000 annually, which, I don't know the market rates of these kind of things are, but it just seems like an extraordinary sum of money.
Karin, thanks. Alistair, I'll bring you back in a few minutes as well. Karin, what do you take from these findings? Is it the quango pay that jumps out for you? Is it the extent of offshore investment? Is the extent of ownership out with Scotland?
I think all of them are interesting. I think I found the wind farms, which my colleague Rob Edwards, who's a veteran of environmental journalism, worked on, had looked at the 50 biggest wind farms in Scotland. Now, for me, what's really fascinating as we come up again to kind of COP26 and the whole climate emergency is that we're now really having to make that transition away from fossil fuels. And so there's been a lot of kind of hand-wringing about what happened with Scotland's oil, about how that resource was allowed to kind of go to kind of foreign ownership and to not to come into Scotland's own economic purse. Now, to find out that over a third of wind farms have got links to offshore tax havens surely must ring alarm bells for people who see this as possibly a chance that maybe wind as Scotland's new oil, as another opportunity.
You contacted the owners, of course, and some of them said that this was standard practice and they had to be competitive, and others said that the offshore companies that they had a link to played no part in the wind operations, and you made that very clear in your piece. Let's bring in James Mackenzie on that point first, and then I'll bring in Andy perhaps on the quango pay. James.
To declare an interest, my only current renewable client is actually Solar Energy Scotland, so I don't have an interest in wind farms at the moment, but I have worked on some in the past.
Do they have any offshore investment connection?
Not that I'm aware of. This is a trade association, so anyway. Okay. I'm happy to reply to you after the meeting about that. In general, I think this is a symptom of failure, and I think it's the failure it's a 2 decades worth of failure where we didn't embed community ownership. We embedded a kind of tepid bit of community benefit into renewables projects. And actually, if you just say we're going to make it really difficult for people to put renewables in, we're going to be super hostile to onshore wind, which ministers have been at a UK and a Scottish government level, then the people who can do it are the people with deep pockets who are potentially not paying all their full tax. And it's a symptom of how we chose to let projects go ahead. And we could have, Karen's right, we had an oil boom, and if we'd been organised, we could have had a Scottish domestic renewables boom over the last 20 years, but we just didn't do it. And so we're left with the kind of, not all, there's loads of good companies working on it, Scottish-based and international, but there's a chunk who are cutting corners because they were allowed to cut corners. It's a failure of regulation.
Thanks for that. And Andy, perhaps on that as well, and then on the Quango pay, where some, Mr. Hare isn't here to defend himself, but some would say you have to pay the rate for a very challenging job.
I think there's, I think the root of the Quango issue, in my view, is transparency rather than pay. Pay is sometimes the consequence of that lack of transparency. I think at the root of it is an issue with the number of Quangos that we have and the level of and the fact that they're not accountable to anybody. They sit in this no man's land between, kind of almost political and almost not. So in some cases, these executives will be on reasonable market pay. I mean, if you take, I don't know, for instance, I'm going to say Scottish Water, because I think it was mentioned in your piece today, Scottish Water.
It is, yeah.
Now, Scottish Water, the chief executive of Scottish Water will have to be paid a reasonable market rate because he's probably, I don't know his history, but he's probably competing with chief execs in the English water companies, for instance. And you need somebody, given the strategic and infrastructure importance of Scottish Water, you need somebody of significant quality to do that job. And that may be, I don't know if that's market pay or not for that job, but there will be some big pay, there'll be some big pay packets in Quangos because there have to be, because you have to get people to do that job rather than drifting off the private sector.
Karin, comment on that. But Karin, comment on that. But you also found gender imbalance as well, didn't you?
Yeah. So first of all, just on that point around, paying market rate and so on, and on the accountability issue. I mean, that's what I heard from a lot of commentators was that there was a lack of accountability, and that stretched right across the range of decisions that were being made by Quangos to the fact that the hires and pay was set by Scottish ministers rather than having a scrutiny over it. In terms of the market rate, I heard from the High Pay Centre that one of the things that can be done around that is really to try and kind of foster talent in-house and not be so reliant on the private sector to bring people in. And I suppose the Scottish Government recognises that point too, because in their current pay policy for Quangos, there is an expectation that every time there's a new hire of a chief executive, it will reduce by 10%. So there definitely is an acknowledgement of that being an issue. In terms of the gender issue, well, yes, we are making some progress. And those targets that Nicola Sturgeon put in a few years ago about the number of women on public sector boards have been, I would say, probably quite successful. We are seeing more women in those roles, but we are seeing that they are paid less. Overall, they were paid £500,000 less in a year, and we saw a lot less women chief execs, a lot less in the top 10, top 20 of people that were highly paid.
Okay, Andy, I'm bringing James in a second. Andy, on the issue of ownership, the example cited was the whisky industry. Nearly 70% of malt whisky distillers ultimately owned by companies out with Scotland. I mean, is it just the case that them's the breaks, or is there anything we can do about that, or do we not need to do anything about that, in your opinion?
Look, I think that there's you can treat this as an issue of globalisation. There are companies based in Scotland who own assets in foreign countries, and the profits of those assets come back here in the form of corporation tax and so on, and we benefit from that. We tend in this country not to particularly like when our own industries are owned by other foreign multinationals, and that's if that's your kind of ideological bent, then that's fine. I think though James is right, if I interpreted what he said earlier correctly, that this is really a bit academic because it's a historic issue in terms of the way that this actually came about, and there's probably not an enormous amount that can be done about it now, to be honest with you. These are still industries which generate a lot of jobs, of course, and are extremely worthy and in fact critical in terms of net zero and so on. But I think you, to a degree, you take the rough with the smooth. If you believe in globalization, then you're going to have situations where some of our industries have foreign interests. And if you don't want that, you probably have to set them up differently at their origin.
James?
Yeah, it's actually funny. I was having a conversation about some of this with Andrew Wilson, who've been on to people on here, who was making the argument that this country ought to have had, and indeed should still have, kind of national capital investment vehicle which funds the kind of clean energy transition or other desirable projects that the country needs. And I'm very fond of Andrew. It's hardly a radical, but that's still way beyond anything that we have been doing. We have just let the free market rip with this stuff. I just wanted to come back to the high pay stuff on Quangos.
Yes, please. Yes, happy to do so.
And actually, it's this is probably what one might call a kind of relatively simplistic socialist perspective, vulgar Marxism, if you will. But £750,000 sounds like an implausible amount of money for anyone to earn. And I would personally like to see either an upper cap on salaries paid by the public sector, or another slightly more cautious proposal. I mean, this is in fact a Tory position, or it was in the early 70s. Top tax rate of 75% worked for Ted Heath. It's a long way above what we are now, but I think if people are being paid an enormous amount of money, then the tax rate should reflect it. And
just a reminder that the average salary in Scotland is around £25,000. So just to put that in perspective.
But again, if I playing devil's advocate, the guy that's being asked to turn around Ferguson Marine, that is one hell of a job.
Well, it's one hell of a salary as well. You could argue.
Good answer. Alistair, let's take us on to one that Karin trailed earlier. I certainly want to talk about this. We've talked so far about Holyrood, but this series has also looked at UK government issues and Scotland Office issues, hasn't it? Bring us up to speed on that, please.
Yeah, so I think one of the examples here that the Ferret looked at was companies involved in arms manufacture, the arms industry. So I think they found that 5 firms who employ, I think it was three quarters of the workforce in Scotland's arms industry, had thousands of closed-door meetings with the UK government between 2011 and 2020. Again, 87 people that worked for one of these firms also worked for the UK government. So there's an issue of this kind of what people call the revolving door between government and outside industries. To go back to the earlier argument about lobbying, I think people would maybe view the kind of access of companies involved in these kind of things with maybe more of a kind of interest in full transparency than they would for maybe charities. That would be the public perception anyway.
Karin, you looked at the Scotland Office in particular, and it said that 90% of the meetings involving ministers were with industry bodies and business groups. But might that not be because all the other stuff like health and education and transport is devolved, and so what they're left with is the macroeconomy?
To a certain extent, but I would just say the same as you said before to me about ministers and energy. You don't need to just listen to business because you're working in the economy. The economy is many things. We talk about things like the well-being economy. Well, where is that in the picture? We talk about economy it affects everyone's lives. And so you shouldn't just be hearing from people who have got vested interests. And if you are a business, if you are industry, you have a duty to your shareholders. You have a duty to make money. And therefore, you're not there just to represent the good of the community, I suppose. So
you're almost saying there is a stock view of the economy, and that is amplified and underlined by the contacts that come again from a stock and standard position.
You end up with a bias, and that is a confirmation bias that repeats.
James, then Andy.
So we talked about what the difference it makes to have regular meetings with ministers. Well, if you get in the door a lot, and obviously, basic PR and comms, if somebody hears your message a lot, they're more likely to take it in and internalise it. And I got just a 20-year-old joke for you from Blair's second term. Who are the 2 most powerful people in Britain? And the answer is Tony Blair and whoever he last spoke to. And so when you see the volume of meetings from the arms industry, and actually that's happening in Scotland. Karen's colleague Billy did a piece about the amount of meetings they have with Scottish ministers, the millions of pounds that the arms industry gets from the Scottish government, even though defence is reserved. So I would definitely be concerned about it. But overall, Westminster is like a black hole.
No, I'll bring in Andy in a second. Karen, you mentioned earlier you thought the situation regarding lobbying was much less satisfactory in Westminster than it is in Holyrood.
Of course, yes, and you only have to register on a register of lobbyists, of official lobbyists in Westminster. So if you're doing that in-house, that doesn't need to appear at all. We know that things in Westminster just now are not good. There's been scandal after scandal. And I suppose that undermines the point that campaigners are making here to make things more transparent, because we can't be complacent. People need to be able to be held to account. It's a healthy thing for democracy. And that's not happening currently in Westminster.
And Andy, what's your take on the Westminster situation?
I agree, actually, and so do a lot of lobbyists at Westminster. Somebody who probably a few of you will know, Ian Anderson from Cicero and Aberdonian, who runs Cicero, an agency down in London. Ian has said many times before that he wants to move towards a Scottish-style system at Westminster because he finds the Westminster system unsatisfactory. On the Scotland Office issue, I think I'd like to see that compared to the other Westminster departments, I think it's quite problematic to analyse the Scotland office on its own, because the vast majority of lobbying going towards the Scotland office will, by definition, not be about devolved areas.
Yeah.
So it's actually a little bit distorting, I think, to look at what goes into the Scotland office and see that as being real in a sense. It's not a accurate view, I suspect, of UK government as a whole, and I think it's not an accurate view of what Scottish companies lobby on, because they'll just be lobbying a Scotland office on things that are in their competence rather than.
I'm going to draw that close. We're coming to the end. Let's get a final word from each. Start with James. What change would you make to the system, perhaps particularly of lobbying, but also of ownership? What change would you make and why?
I would deal with something we've not touched on here. I would ban all company donations to political parties, in addition to making all ministers' meetings public. And I would cap individual donations too at about 2,000 a year. I think that's where the real problem lies. Somebody gives money to the Tory party and then they get a policy decision. So the private money goes to the Tory party and the Tory party gives public money to the company. That's where the real grift is happening at Westminster.
And Andy Maciver, I won't ask you to comment on that because you used to work for the Conservative Party, admittedly rather long time ago. But what change would you make and why?
I would close the exemptions. There's too many exemptions, and if we close the exemptions and we open up a lot more transparency in it, what I want to see is a situation where people start to understand that what we do is actually relatively dull, normal work. And if we close the exemptions and people start to realise that, then I think that will actually be helpful for everybody.
Thank you for that. Alistair and then Karin. Alistair Grant.
Yeah, I would take another look at the exemptions, and I think I'm a journalist, so transparency is a good thing in terms of stories, and it's also a good thing for the public. So yeah,
we're in favour of openness. And finally, Karin Goodwin from the Ferret. Karin, please.
So transparency is certainly important, but also there's more to equal access than just making it transparent. So I would make sure that we found new and innovative ways of having more diversity of thought and diversity of all kinds, getting the ears of ministers and people with power and influence.
Thank you, Karin, and thank you one and all. That's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the series all week in the Herald. As Alistair said, you can still catch up with it. You can register and take out a subscription to the Herald generally and catch up on all of that series. To my two journalists, to my two lobbyists, to all of you who listened and will catch up with this programme later, many, many thanks indeed, and toodaloo.
This podcast was brought to you by The Herald. Take 20% off an annual subscription to The Herald with our exclusive podcast code. Just add HeraldPod 2021 to your basket and get instant, unfiltered access to our website. And you can also get involved with the Brian Taylor podcast as well. Tune in on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube every Thursday afternoon to catch Brian and his panel chat live and ask your questions to the people across the political scene.